Well, good evening, everybody. We're having a little technical issues here. I think we've got them worked out. We'll see. So if we have something go wrong, just bear with us for a little bit. This week we're going to be talking about Job. But before we get into Job, I want to just go back to the Tower of Babel. And just incidentally, real quick, before I do that, there is a new set of packets back on the back pew. It starts with lesson 11, but you'll notice your last lesson that you have is lesson 8 in your packet. So what I've done is the first two lessons we had, I didn't have notes for those. So I created lessons 1 and 2, and what that did is that kind of fouled up our numbering. So my apologies. You're not missing anything if you've gotten all the packets. Okay, even though the numbering doesn't match up. So I'm going to be using this study with a different congregation. So I was trying to get everything kind of all lined out finally. You guys are my guinea pigs. So anyways, sorry for the mix up, but if you grab packet 11, that will be the lesson that follows lesson number 8 in your packets. But tonight we're in lesson number 9, which is Job. So that's just thoroughly confusing, isn't it? But just I'll assure you, you're correct if you're looking at Job's notes for tonight. All right, so last time we were together, which was 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And we talked about how when mankind is unified, we have a tendency in our nature to resist and rebel against God. And this is the reason why God divided us. He divided us up into nations and cultures and different languages so that we would actually draw closer to Him. So the farther apart we are from one another, the more likely we are to draw closer to Him, which is sort of counterintuitive, but that does seem to be the way our nature works. We also talked about how the speaking in tongues in the New Testament, the gift of speaking in tongues that we see first in Acts chapter 2, that this represents a reversal of what happened at the Tower of Babel. And the message seems to be that in Christ, true unity among all mankind can be achieved. That when we attempt to create unity apart from Christ or apart from God, we end up going further away from God. But in Jesus, we can unite together regardless of where we come from in the world, regardless of what nation we grow up in, regardless of what language we speak, that in Jesus, all of these distinctions are taken away. So this is God's way of reversing the consequences of Babel and giving us true unity in Jesus Christ. And then the last thing we did was we went through a bunch of different slides of temples all across the world. And we just noticed how a lot of these temples have very similar architecture. They look like, we call them pyramids, but they kind of look like man-made mountains is what they look like. And they all have steps that go up to the top. And there just does seem to be a uniformity to all of this. And I think that this is an echo of Babel, of that event that changed the course of the human race for all time. And as we spread out across the world, we just kind of kept doing that same sort of thing, building those same sorts of structures. And that does seem to be an echo, if you will, of what was happening at Babel. So that was a couple of weeks ago. Any questions or comments? We all good to move into Job tonight? Let's keep moving then. So we're not going to study the entire book of Job because it's 42 chapters. And we've done that on Wednesday nights in the past. It's been a few years ago, but we did study Job on Wednesday nights. It was a great study. But you might be asking yourself, we've been in the book of Genesis up to this point. Why are we studying Job right here? Well, this goes back to something that we talked about in the first couple of lessons that we were together. And that is the Old Testament is arranged thematically. It's not arranged chronologically, it's arranged by theme. So the book of Genesis appears to be arranged chronologically, but when you put Genesis together with the other 39 books of the Old Testament, the book of Job sits kind of right somewhere around chapters 11 and 12 of the book of Genesis. So the Old Testament is arranged by the law, by the history, by poetry. And of course, Job fits in with those books of poetry, like the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Another little interesting tidbit that I ran across, and there's no way to verify this, but there was a tradition among the Jewish people that Job was actually written by Moses. Now again, we have no corroborating evidence of that. We have no indication of that anywhere else in the Bible. This was just simply a tradition among the Jews. It's more likely, though, that the book came from the time period of Solomon. But I think that Jewish tradition might give us just a little bit of an inkling of just how old this book was. Solomon, of course, lived about 450 years after the children of Israel left the land of Egypt. So this is a very, very old book. And it does seem like, based on some internal evidence, that Job was probably a contemporary of Abraham, that they're living around the same period of time. Let's call it about, let's say somewhere between 2000 BC and 1800 BC. And as I said a few weeks ago, dating these books is very, very difficult. So I think we're looking at that time period. We're looking at this time period around where Abraham lived, and that's why we're studying Job here. Since we're going through these stories chronologically, it just makes sense to sort of insert Job here and talk about his account. So if you're wondering why, from Genesis to Job, that's the reason why. All right, let's take a look at the first 5 verses of the first chapter of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. Yeah. All right, so the land of Uz is right about over in here. The land of Uz, it's a little difficult to pin down where exactly it was. I rhymed and didn't really intend to there. But it's traditionally held that the land of Uz was also the land of Edom. And we have some scriptures that verify that. So we're talking about this part of the world over here. So Job is from the land of Uz, which tells us a little bit of something about him. This man is not a descendant of Abraham. He's not a Jew. So we're talking about a Gentile. It's a book that we would say is about a Gentile, which is pretty unusual when it comes to the Old Testament. And we also noticed in those first 5 verses that Job was a very wealthy man. He was a wealthy man according to the standards of his day. And not only was he wealthy, he was virtuous. There are a few men in the Bible that are really upheld as the paragons of virtue. In the book of Ezekiel, God singles out 3 men, Noah, Job, and Daniel. And he basically says, if these guys were alive today, they couldn't even deliver Jerusalem from the destruction I'm about to send on it. So that just gives you a sense of how God viewed men like Noah, Job, and Daniel. Job was a great man. He was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. So this is a man really without peer in the world, kind of like Noah. He's a bit of an echo of Noah in that respect. And one of the other notable things about Job is he interceded for his children. Did you notice that? He would get up early and offer sacrifices for them in case they had sinned and had not made restitution with God. So he was interceding on behalf of his children, which again gives us an indication of where this book likely occurs chronologically, or at least when it took place chronologically. We're talking about the time before the giving of the covenant of Moses. This is when people worship God as they saw fit. Yeah, Chad, go ahead.
I'm not asking this to be argumentative, it's an honest question.
Yeah.
If Job is a contemporary of Abraham's, then is it fair to call him a Gentile because the Jewish people didn't exist yet?
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah.
He's not Jewish, but
yeah.
He wasn't really a Gentile either, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, and I guess I guess I am assuming that he's outside the line of Abraham.
Right.
So, yeah. And at least among the Jews, I do think that they held Job to be technically a Gentile, so to speak. So they didn't view him as being a part of their people.
Right.
I'll just put it that way. So, yeah, I guess technically speaking, that would be right. But again, we're not... Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. That's good. Good observation, good clarification. Other questions, comments? We good so far, everybody? Everybody tracking with me? Yep. All right. Let's get into these next few verses. And this is one of the most interesting episodes, I think, in the entire Bible. Now, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. I said this is one of the most interesting episodes in the Bible because, as far as I know, this is one of the few times where we actually have Satan in the presence of God. So you have this episode where the sons of God, which represent the angelic hosts, and we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about Noah, how in the 6th chapter of Genesis it talks about the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the sons of God appear to be those people who remain faithful to God in that context. But here the sons of God refer to the angels. And among the angelic host is Satan. And remember, the word or the name Satan just means adversary. And Satan is presenting himself before God. Now, this is sometimes a little difficult for us to wrap our minds around because we read scriptures about God's holiness, how God cannot be in the presence of evil, how he cannot be in the presence of sin. And yet here we have Satan presenting himself before God with an audience before the throne of God. So that's something to think about and chew on. How is that possible? We also see echoed once again just how good a man Job is. Job is a man without peer. And a moment ago I mentioned Ezekiel 14:14. That's where God singles out Noah, Job, and Daniel. And he says, if these three guys were alive right now, not even their righteousness could deliver Jerusalem for the punishment that's about to happen. And that just gives you an idea of how highly God esteemed Job. He's put right alongside great men like Noah and Daniel. But Satan has an accusation. Satan accuses God of favoritism, that the only reason why Job is a good guy is because God is protecting him. Take away his protection, and we'll just see how good of a guy Job really is. And this is what leads Satan, or this is when God gives Satan permission to take Job's wealth and kill his family. That's the first test of Job here in the remainder of the first chapter. I'm not going to take the time to read that, but as the account goes, he is robbed and his children are killed in a terrible windstorm. And I don't know what that would be like. To lose a substantial portion of your wealth and to lose your children in a single day. I mean, I don't know that there are many people who have had to endure that level of loss and trauma in a single moment. Job, though, responds in a very godly way. Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped, and he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. Oh, that I could be as mature as this man in this moment. I mean, this is just an exemplary response to just tear your clothing as a sign of mourning and lamentation, but accept. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And this is why God was so complimentary of Job. God, of course, sees in a different way than the rest of us. He sees the heart. So when God talks with Satan about how good of a man Job is, he knows. He knows Job's quality. And Job answers the bell, so to speak. You guys see anything else in chapter number 1? Any questions or comments? Anybody want to go back over any of that information? We good so far? Yep. All right, let's keep moving then. So we get into the second testing in chapter 2, and it sounds a lot like the first chapter. And there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has will he give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." All right, so in this section we see some important truths to pull out. First of all, Satan doubles down, right? He said in the first chapter, Job's a good man because you protect him, basically. You play favorites. But in this section, he says, all right, if you actually allow me to harm him physically, he will curse you. So this is Satan's way of doubling down, so to speak, with God. He still holds fast to his integrity, God says, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. Here's one of the important truths that I want you to think a lot about. And it's that statement, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. This is God speaking to Satan. Who caused Job all of these harms? Well, Satan did, right? But Satan did so with whose permission? With God's permission. And that's an important clarification. What does Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13? That God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able to bear. God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able to bear. And that's what we see here with Job. God allowed Satan to do this. Satan did this under God's authority, under God's auspices. So, in a sense, God removed that hedge of protection, and he allowed Satan to do what he willed with Job that first time. And this is something that I think we have to accept, even though sometimes it can be very difficult to swallow. God allows bad things to happen to good people. Job is as good a man as we read about in the entire Bible. And yet even this good man had terrible things happen to him. And God allowed those things to happen. Evil times are not necessarily a punishment for evil behavior. And that's another important truth that we need to pull out of this. Now, sometimes we make a foolish decision and we pay the consequences, right? That's what Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 6. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. So if I sin and if I practice sin, what can I expect to reap from that? I can expect to reap consequences. There's going to be consequences or punishments that come as a result of my sin. But not every bad thing that happens is a punishment for evil behavior. Sometimes bad things just happen, and they happen without apparent explanation. And I'd like for you to notice, and of course I didn't have you read chapters 3 through 41, so if you ever go back through and read chapters 3 through 41, one of the things that you will notice is when Job is talking, he never once, not a single time, does he ever discuss the possibility that Satan has worked against him. Not a single time. And that's an important lesson for us to keep in mind. That one of the benefits we have on this side of the book of Job is we can actually know that sometimes bad things happen to us because there is real evil at work in the world. That Satan is a malevolent force that is working against us. And sometimes these bad things happen because Satan is a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And the book of Job helps us to see that. Job himself did not seem to understand that, but we can understand that now. So if a bad thing happens to us, we shouldn't automatically assume, well, that bad thing happened because I'm a bad person. We shouldn't think that at all. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. And if we find some reason why this bad thing has happened, if we can connect something, some choice, some action, some statement that we make that led to the consequence, yeah, we can correct that. But sometimes they just happen for no reason that we can discern. And that's one of the most important lessons we can pull out of the book of Job. Jordan, that looked like a hand right there. No, I'm just hopeful, right? I'm just very hopeful.
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Okay, I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about chapters 3 through 41, even though we're not going to read it. But in these, 38, 39 chapters, you have this ongoing conversation between 5 people. It starts out as a conversation between Job and his 3 friends, and then they're joined by a young man by the name of Elihu. And then in chapter 38, God comes along and God basically just corrects everything that everyone's been saying up to this point. And the 3 friends of Job end up spending a lot of their time expressing their understanding of the world. And what you read in their statements is basically the conventional wisdom. They spend a lot of time trying to convince Job that he's suffering because he has sinned in some way. I'll give you a few examples. Eliphaz says this in chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. Bildad talks about this in chapter 8, verses 2 through 7 and verse 20. And Zophar, the 3rd friend, talks about it in chapter 20, verses 20 through 29. So all 3 friends spend a lot of time trying to convince Job, your kids died, and you lost all your wealth, and you're covered from head to toe with boils, because secretly you're a sinner. You're an unrighteous man. That these bad things have happened because you are wicked. And not only do they accuse him of being a wicked man, they also accuse his children of being sinners as well. In fact, Eliphaz in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, just basically, what a thing to say to a guy right after his kids have died in a terrible accident, that they died because they're sinners. This is just a horrible thing to say. It's why at one point Job looks at his 3 friends and says, you guys are miserable comforters. And it's obvious why. Bildad in chapter 8, verse number 4 also intimates that his children are sinners. And again, these 3 men are basically trying to convince Job of what is the conventional wisdom of the world at that time. Remember, these people are living before the law. They're living before Jesus Christ. They have an understanding of the world that's admirable. In fact, I remember going through the book of Job, and Chad was teaching, and I remember he got kind of excited because there's these indications along the way about creation and some of the observations about the world that you could find in the book of Job. They knew stuff about the world, but their understanding of God's ways were very incomplete. And it's obvious from the things that they say that they really don't understand God and his ways really much at all. They level some more accusations at Job. They say things like, well, you've helped others, but you won't even help yourself. Eliphaz says this in chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. They accuse Job of living in denial. Zophar and Eliphaz both say this. They say things like, Job, you're just defying the conventional wisdom. Everybody understands, Job, that if a bad thing happens to you, it's because you're a bad person. So they expend all of this energy trying to convince Job that deep down he has been wicked. And I'll just give you one example of this. This is from Eliphaz in chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. He's talking to Job. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. What's Eliphaz intimating? You're sick, your kids are dead, and you're a poor man because deep down, you're really a wicked person. No innocent person would ever suffer in this way, so obviously you're a sinner. That seems to be the crux of their argument for a couple dozen chapters, and it gets pretty old. If you've read the book of Job, if you studied it, it just feels like a broken record. Over and over, they come back to this same idea and just try to convince Job that really you're just a bad guy, and that's why these bad things have happened. Anybody got anything they want to say here? Somebody want to jump in? We good so far here?
One of the things I saw their way was
Yeah.
in that chapter 3
Yeah.
basically starts off, he's not blaming God for anything, he's blaming himself ruining the day that he was born.
Yeah.
Basically saying, I wish I was never born
Yeah.
because of all this. But he still, like you said, he still never blames God for what happened to him.
Yeah, he wants an explanation from God, and he understands that these things have not happened without God's permission, so to speak. But not once does he ever blame God, so to speak. Yeah. And that's a nice segue, Jeff, into something that I just like to point out. And the book of Job I find to be very comforting, because the book of Job is a book about a man's very real experiences. And I just want to pull out a few things that Job says about himself in his various speeches. In chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, he says he's sad every day, nearly all day. In that same chapter, verses 6 and 7, he talks about how he's had a change in his appetite or his diet. He has recurrent thoughts of death, verses 8 and 9. In verses 14 through 30, he talks about his feelings of isolation. Jeff mentioned this in chapter 3. He talks about just feeling worthless. And in chapter 7, verse 4, he talks about how he can't sleep at night. This is Job's description of his experience. In our day and age, what would we label Job? What condition would we label Job as experiencing?
Depression.
It's depression. This is depression. And you can understand why he would be depressed. He has just gone through a series of traumatic events. Now, the Bible doesn't call it depression. That's a word we've come up with. And the point I want to drive home is when you look at these symptoms, when we say, I'm feeling a little depressed, a lot of times what we mean by that is, I feel sad. But depression's a lot bigger than just sadness. In fact, all 6 of these that I've listed here are all symptoms of depression. And I bring this up because I've heard people say, well, if you're a Christian, how can you possibly be depressed? Well, there's lots of reasons for depression. Sometimes people have issues with the serotonin level in their brain, and that triggers feelings of depression. That's a physical problem, right? That's a physiological problem, I should say. So we can look at the example of Job, but I think find some comfort and consolation in the fact here's a righteous man who has gone through a terrible set of circumstances, and he's feeling the effects. Now, throughout much of his speeches, he handles it the right way. But I think it's good for us to acknowledge that, in our modern terminology, we would call Job depressed. And I think that that's a comforting thought. At least it comforts me to see that. Anybody have anything they want to say about that? That's pretty much all I want to say as far as Job and his 3 friends, their comments. Anybody else want to chime in here? Chad says no, so he's good. And everybody else good?
The last 2 verses in that chapter 7 are kind of interesting. How
Yeah.
he talks to, he's thinking he sinned at that point, and I don't know how long this is between the time everything happened and his friends come and starts talking to him, but he eventually has gotten to the point where he's blaming himself now for what happened to him, that he's done something that he didn't know about, and then he's wondering why hasn't this been taken away from me? I've done the sacrifices, but
Yeah, I read that just a little bit differently, Jeff. Verse 20, have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target so that I am a burden to myself? What I read there is not him acknowledging that he sinned, but he's saying, have I sinned? I don't think I have. What I read as I read Job's exploration of all this is, Job can see nothing in his conduct to account for what has happened to him. And he never claims to be like a perfect man. But he basically examines his life and says, I can't find anything that I have done that would deserve this kind of treatment from God. And I don't understand it.
what version did you read that out?
That's the New King James.
King James?
Yeah, and the other versions.
The old King James says, I have sinned.
Yeah.
That's
exactly.
where the...
Yeah, and I just check a couple of other translations here. Yeah. This is the ESV. If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Yeah, and still there's an implication there. He's not saying he has sinned, but if I have, why are you treating me like this? Why are my children being taken away? Why not instead, as he goes on to say in verse 21, why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? So I get the sense as I read through all of Job's speeches that he's trying to figure out why this bad thing has happened, because he's led a pretty clean life. And I think we all can kind of relate to that. If we've ever been the victim of someone else's sin, we can wonder, why, God, did you allow that to happen to me? And one of the answers we get from the book of Job is, well, because evil is at work in the world. There are evil people, and there is evil afoot, so to speak. So I find that to be comforting once again. Other questions or comments? We good? Let's finish this up then. Let's talk a little bit about how God responds to Job. And, Job's last statements, he does begin to cross a line as he gets to the end of his defense of himself. And he does begin to act self-righteous. Like, what have I done to deserve this, God? Why are you allowing this to happen to me? And in that respect, I do think that Job has crossed a line. And God, when he begins speaking to Job, it's a pretty firm rebuke, isn't it? Who are you to question me, right? And he spends the next couple of chapters reminding Job of his place in the universe, so to speak. And he poses just a bunch of rhetorical questions to Job. And what God is trying to drive home with Job is he's reminding Job of his sovereignty, of his wisdom, and his power. And what I find really fascinating about the book of Job is Job spends all this time trying to understand why this has happened to him. And not a single time in chapters 38 through 41, when God is talking, does he ever say, this is why this happened to you, Job. God never gives an explanation. And I think that that's fascinating, because you would think in a moment like this, God would explain to Job, well, Satan's testing you. But not one single time does he ever say that to Job. Instead, he reminds Job of his sovereignty, of his wisdom, and his power. And all of this seems to be to drive home the message that Job needs to learn to trust God more fully. That if Job will just trust in God and not continue to search for the unanswerable, if he will stop searching for the answer to the question why and just trust, God will look after him. And that's in fact how the book ends. The book ends with Job being rewarded. He ends up at the beginning of chapter 42 basically repenting for going too far, and he intercedes on behalf of his friends. And God ends up blessing Job and blessing him with more children. His wealth is restored to him. He lives to a good old age. And the lesson seems to be best expressed by James in James chapter 5, verses 10 and 11. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. What is the end intended by the Lord? Well, God intends to reward those who are faithful. That regardless of what happens to us in life, if we are faithful to him, there is a reward that lies ahead. God is compassionate and merciful. And again, I don't know that that is something we should expect in this life, but we can, through Jesus Christ, expect great riches, comfort, and peace and mercy in the life to come. So chapter 42 is kind of, it's almost like a picture of heaven, so to speak, that this is the great reward that awaits those who are faithful to God. As James says earlier in James chapter 1, that those who endure testing will receive the crown of life which shall not fade away. So God intends to reward those who are faithful to him in the face of all kinds of challenges and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. That's really the message of the book of Job. All right. We ran through that pretty quick. That's all the slides I have for this evening. Anybody got any questions or comments? Jordan, have you come up with a question yet? Because you said not yet a few minutes ago, so I'll put you on the spot. You got anything you want to chime in on?
Well, James, when it talks about Job in chapter 5, I guess you could consider Job was a faithful person. Maybe that's a question first before I continue.
Is he a faithful person? Yeah, I think so.
Even with his response towards the end of Job, he's still a faithful person.
Yes.
So I think that gives me hope
Yeah,
and comfort as well.
yeah.
That Job was human. He went through life.
Yeah. And you know, what we would describe Job going through is, we would use the word trauma. These were traumatic events. And one of the lessons that I take away from the book of Job is, God understands our frame, right? He created us. He knows that we are weak. And God can handle us asking the big questions of him. You know, that it's not a sign of unfaithfulness to explore the reasons why, but rather it's a sign of trying to grow in faithfulness. And that seems to be the way that God handles Job. Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, I had a fly hit me.
Yeah, I'm getting flies up here too. They must be waking up with all the warm weather. Go ahead, Chad.
So in 42, would you say it's fair to say that the relationship between God and Job has been repaired?
Yeah, I'd say so.
So in James, when it says that we have seen the end intended by the Lord, happiness, I think, is part of that, but wouldn't part of that also be that our relationship with the Lord is repaired through Jesus Christ?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would say that. Yeah, and I don't know how far I would take that. I don't know how much damage Job did to his relationship with God. I think it's more that in his pain, he went too far. And I think we can relate to that as well. Because sometimes when you are in pain, you can take things way too far. And God's response is basically his way of yanking Job back and saying, wait a second, man, who are you? Who are you to question me? And that's, again, a good lesson for us to remember, because when we're hurting, we're not always thinking clearly. And I think we can see that with Job, that he wasn't thinking all that clearly, especially toward the end. And again, you can kind of understand why, too. He's had these friends that have basically sat around and told him he's a wicked man, and that's why these terrible things have happened. That's a stumbling block, isn't it? That is absolutely a stumbling block. And again, that should be something that we should take to heart, that when we have a brother or sister in Christ, a neighbor, a friend going through something like this, we need to be very careful what we say. And sometimes it's just best not to say anything at all. I'll illustrate it with this example. So back in 2011, my mom died on Memorial Day. And on Labor Day, her mother, my grandmother, was in the hospital dying that weekend. So within 3 months, I lost both my mom and my grandma. And grandma went into the hospital on like a Thursday, but she didn't end up dying until on a Tuesday. So we were basically just kind of hanging out at the hospital all weekend. And of course, you know, people would come by and they'd spend time and, you know, just, you know, be a presence. But one of the people that I really appreciated was a brother in Christ who basically just sat in the waiting room and really didn't say anything to anyone. He was just sort of there. And I look back at that example and I thought to myself more than one time, you know, that was as comforting as anything else anybody else did, because he wanted to be there. He wanted to be a support, but he also didn't want to make it about him. He didn't want to be intrusive. And, you know, he was willing to talk if you went up and engaged him, but otherwise he was just a presence. And sometimes that's really all that's needed. So those 7 days that Job's friends spent with him sitting in sackcloth and ashes, that was probably the best thing they could have done for him. And if that's how the book had ended, they would have done a good work. And that's just good for us to bear in mind, that we can assume that we understand what someone else is going through and end up saying a lot of wrong things and doing some damage if we're not cautious. So learn from Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar. Better just to sit there quietly and be a friend in that way if you don't really know what to say. Because sometimes nothing really needs to be said. And when you feel compelled to say something, you can end up just doing a lot more damage in the long run. So that's another lesson to take away from the book of Job. Anything else anybody wants to say? That's a great book. I really love that book a lot. Next week we're going to be getting into the story of Abraham. That'll be Genesis chapter 12, Lord willing. So we'll...
Next week or 2 weeks?
2 weeks, pardon me. 2 weeks, yeah. I will probably be gone next Thursday. So we may have some plans changing. So I might be here. I might not be here. I just don't know for sure. So